the Upshot, Multi-World Disc Golf's podcast about the latest in the disc golf world. I'm the editor, Charlie Eisenhood. Joining me is Josh Mansfield on this Wednesday, October 25th. Sorry we're a day late with the show this week. I was in transit all day yesterday. My original flight, Josh, out of San Diego, is actually still delayed.
Oh my God.
It's still delayed a day later. It was scheduled for like 12:30 p.m. departure back to New York. And then it got delayed 3 hours. Then it got delayed 6 hours. Then it got delayed like 9 hours till like 10 o'clock last night, Pacific time. And then they're like, oh, now it's delayed until 2 p.m. Wednesday. And I'm like, okay, hang on a second. You don't just get to keep calling it delayed at that point. Like, if it has been more than 24 hours, you canceled the flight and you rescheduled it for the next day, right? Like,
What was the tournament during COVID that they like rescheduled, but it was for the next year?
oh, yeah.
That's what that feels like.
We've postponed this tournament until next year. Like, what are you talking about? That's canceling.
Presented by, sponsored by, powered by.
So anyway, I called JetBlue and they got me out of LA. So I drove up to LA and got home last night. So all is well. All is well in the world.
Good. Man, sounds like a rough trip.
Yeah, I mean, you just have to advocate for yourself in these situations. It helps that I fly a lot and that, get status and like they go out of your way to help you a little bit more. But,
right.
If you're going to get horribly delayed or like you see that your plane is still in Minneapolis and you're supposed to fly in an hour and you're like, oh, this is not happening. You got to get on the phone or you got to go talk to the agent at the airport and you got to say, hey, like, I'm about to get brutally delayed. What is there another option for me? Can I fly to a different airport? And every airline's different, but if you don't do that, you end up just sitting and waiting until your delayed aircraft is 24 hours late.
48 hours counting.
It can get bad.
Yeah. Yep.
Anyway,
that's a good point. Be nice about it though.
That's right.
Be good humans.
That's right. You got to. It does you no good to rage at the person who has nothing to do with the delay of the airplane. All right. So, Josh, it's time. It's time. It's the definitive time to have the conversation about MPO Player of the Year. And it's been, people have been talking about it. People have been thinking about it. Players have been weighing in on social media. We're going to look at the numbers. We're going to look at the facts. And we're going to make our assessments today. And, maybe this has influence over other people. Maybe not. But, the votes are going to be happening soon. We both have a media vote. Mm-hmm. We're going to make our votes. So we're going to think through the whole scenario. Now, let's just go ahead and up front say where our head is at now. Before we've had the conversation, okay? Right now, if I just was like, vote for who's number one, who would you pick?
Mm-hmm. I'd probably pick Isaac.
Okay. You want to give a quick synopsis as to why?
Yeah, majors, right? It's one word synopsis, majors, right? That to me is the defining part of our season. And when you have somebody who wins two of them, that automatically, I think, puts them in the front runner case for me. And you have to make a case for me when you have somebody who dominates the majors. You have to make a case why they don't deserve it.
Sure. Okay. And right now, coming into this, I'm on Team Calvin.
Okay.
And quick synopsis, I think even before we sit and look at the numbers, I know what they're going to tell me, which is that he was truly excellent throughout the entire season, start to finish. And, obviously the fact that it's a conversation here is that he didn't perform at his best when it mattered the most. So I acknowledge that. But I also want to point out that he still played great. We'll get to all of these things as we go through it. But I'm currently, coming into this, I am on Team Calvin.
Team Calvin, okay.
Now, I think we do need to consider some other players, Josh. Even if we rule them out, we need to look at them and think about, should they be in the conversation? And I think those players are Ricky Wysocki, who, of course, closed out the year with the win at the Tour Championship, Kyle Klein, who closed out the year with a win at USDGC, and Gannon Buhr, who has more Elite Series wins than anybody He got 3. That was the most. Everybody else had 2. So let's talk about those guys and start to look at some of the context and the numbers here and think about, whether they belong in this final decision with Calvin and Isaac. Sound good?
That sounds good to me.
All right.
And I want to say it's impressive because going into the last stretch, it was a 3-horse race. It was Calvin, Isaac, and then Gannon. And Ricky and Kyle getting those late wins elevated them. I did not think we would have 5 people on this list when we started.
Totally.
3 weeks ago, I did not think we would have had 5 people on this list.
I'm right there with you. But each of those guys, I should say those 2 guys, Ricky and Kyle, already had a win. And
Correct.
So winning a second one and a big one like that matters. So they get to 2. All right. So look, in the wins department, everybody's pretty much in the same realm, right? Everybody got 2 wins except Gannon, who got 3.
But Kyle and Ricky get plus wins, right? USDGC Disc Golf Pro Tour Championship.
Right.
So Gannon wins standard elite events, which absolutely deserve credit. But the major, and I think we can argue the Disc Golf Pro Tour Championship, both have a little bit extra prestige added in, which is why that kind of keeps them in that same realm around Gannon. They feel very equitable there.
So let's take a look at some of the numbers here. Ricky had 3 podiums. That was actually 20% of his season. Now, keep in mind, Ricky missed a lot of the year, which for me actually matters in this conversation a little bit. It is at least a little bit of a knock that he played less. Now, if he came out and he just absolutely smoked everybody when he was playing, it probably would have been enough, but I just want to put that out there.
Same thing with Kyle Klein.
Right. He missed
had
a little
4
time.
podiums.
Missed a little time. Had 4 podiums. Gannon had 5 podiums. They each had a lot of top 10s, although Kyle only top 10'd at 47% of his Elite Series Majors Tour Championship. So we're excluding silvers from our discussion today for the most part. And so, the other thing with Kyle is, along with not finishing inside the top 10 nearly as much as the other guys, his average finish was markedly worse. Now, that is skewed somewhat by his DNFs when his back was hurt. Like, if you take that chunk of his season out, things look a little bit better. But even if you look at his median finish, which was 14th, which, really reduces the punishment of the outlying, big numbers that you take when you DNF, he was still, everybody else had a median finish of under 10, and he was at 14. Right. Do we even really want to keep talking about it? Like,
so here's the big picture, right? Those 3 had at least, so Ricky and Kyle, for example, you mentioned something that I think is the biggest sticking point for me. They had good seasons. Their stats are up there, but Ricky and Kyle had the lowest podiums and the lowest podium percentage. They have some of the highest average finishes. They have, the issue for me, and then their wins are good, but when you look at the 2 big ones, Calvin and Isaac, you have a player who played ultra consistent all season long, or a player who wins at the highest stage. Ricky and Kyle are splitting the difference of both of them, and that's a problem, right? They don't have the longevity of the season to contend with Calvin. So if you want to look at they had a really consistent season when they played, if you want to make that argument, then you just, Calvin's better then. And then if you're like, well, but they won at the highest level, then it's like, well, if that matters to you, then Isaac has to win. So they have impressive resumes, but they have watered down versions of both Isaac and Calvin. And so I have a hard time really including Ricky and Kyle specifically for the reason of the longevity in either of their, the consideration for player of the year.
Yeah. And, you look at, just multiple outside top 20 finishes for Kyle. He did play really well at the majors. His major finish average was 6.75. That's second only to Isaac. Of course, it helps to win one in your average department, but right. Credit where credit is due. He showed
Absolutely.
up big at the majors relative to the rest of his season. But you make a great point. And I think that that's the problem with all of these guys, including Gannon, which is that just like when you compare those seasons head to head with Calvin and Isaac, you can't get past those two, right?
Yeah.
Like,
and that's
go ahead.
Calvin and Isaac both earned about 50% in total earnings of what Gannon earned. And we'll get into those numbers with
50%
Calvin and
more,
Isaac.
you mean?
50% more. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
50% more. Gannon actually earned, despite having 3 wins, earned the lowest amount of money on the season out of these 5 guys. So, I mean, that's another one that just, man, Gannon, talk about a roller coaster. 50th, first. Miss cash, win the tournament. Like that, and that's fun. That's cool. 3 wins, but given the 2 guys that everyone else is going up against, I think Gannon also gets excluded, unfortunately.
I mean, credit where it's due. You win 3 tournaments. That's a successful season.
Yes.
Like if Gannon, if you wind the clock back to before last season, and then you give Gannon this season, the hype would have been way higher, right?
Yes.
It's just that the expectations rose so much for him that like him getting 3 wins and being a little bit more inconsistent. Well, I should say a lot more inconsistent. I mean, his 2022 season was special. I mean, he was not only getting wins, but he was constantly at the top. He had a Calvin-like season. And so this was just a little bit more of an up and down year. He still got 12 top 10s, which is more than Isaac Robinson. But it doesn't come anywhere close to Calvin's 19.
Right.
19.
Yeah, so for those guys, it's just hard to. It's hard. You can't. There's no stat to pick out except for the wins column for Gannon, which is why he was always in this conversation more. But literally every other stat, Calvin or Isaac does it better.
Yeah,
for all 3 of these guys. So,
Gannon. Like, let's just do a little thing here really quick. If you compare Gannon directly to Calvin, okay, because then you take the majors conversation out of it because it's you're not comparing him to Isaac.
Sure.
Just Gannon versus Calvin. Gannon has more wins, and otherwise he fails in every other category. Right, 5 podiums versus Calvin's 12. 12 top 10s versus Calvin's 19. An average finish of 12.9 to Calvin's 4. He finished on average 4th place this year. He only missed the top 10 once. It was at Champions Cup when he finished 16th. Gannon was worse at the majors than Calvin. You already mentioned the money. Median finish, Gannon 9.5, Calvin 3. 1 win does not outweigh all of the rest of that. For me.
No, I think so too.
Okay.
I think so too. Okay, so there it is. I think Ricky, Gannon, Kyle, amazing seasons. Seasons that in a lot of other seasons would be like second place because we've had a lot more dominance, I think, in the past. But in the season of parity, all 3 of them have very strong resumes, but not enough to contend with Calvin and Isaac.
Sure.
At Pound, the quality of our gear runs deeper than the stitching. That's why we make everything right here in the U.S., employing highly skilled, well-paid professionals. From bomb-proof Cordura fabric to YKK zippers and recycled plastics, we source the highest quality U.S. materials to make the most comfortable, durable pack in disc golf. Our lifetime warranty stays with the pack, not the purchaser. So regardless of how you find us, we will be here to make sure your pack stays on the course and out of the landfill. Pound's integrity is held together with more than just thread.
We knew we were going to get here, so let's just go ahead and get here. It's Calvin versus Isaac.
Yep.
Let's talk about the numbers. We're going to get to a bunch of different topics of conversation along the way here. But let me just run through the actual raw statistics first, okay?
Okay.
They each have 2 wins. Calvin won Las Vegas Challenge in Jonesboro, so early in the season, right? Both wins coming in the first quarter almost of the season, maybe third. Isaac Robinson wins Champions Cup and Worlds, 2 majors. Calvin, podium 60% of the time. He had 12 podium finishes this year. Isaac Robinson had 7. That was 37% of the time. Isaac, 58% of the time hitting the top 10. Calvin does it 95% of the time, 8 more times than Isaac, 19 versus 11. Average finish, Calvin 4th, Isaac 15.7. Now, major count, obviously 2-0 Isaac in Isaac's favor. Average major finish as a result, also better for Isaac. He was 4.3 to Calvin's 7.5. Earnings, Calvin edges out Isaac ever so slightly. He has 99,825. Again, this is at Elite Series majors and the Tour Championship. We're not looking at silvers here. Versus Isaac's 95,469. It helps to kind of narrow the scope a little bit because you jump all this A tiers and nonsense that, like, sure, you can earn some extra money, but like, let's compare apples to apples. Worst finish for Calvin, it was 16th. For Isaac, it was 82nd at the Las Vegas Challenge. Median finish, Calvin 3rd, Isaac 7th. So, Josh, it really just is about this kind of conversation about majors versus everything else. I think it's notable that Calvin's worst finish of the season was 16, and Isaac's average finish on the season, if you round to the nearest integer, is 16, 15.7. That is a remarkable statistic in Calvin's favor.
It is.
So I want you to start to make the case for me about why the 2 majors should outweigh all of this other evidence.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things to me that we have to answer questions for. Number one, what is the value of a major? So I know that the Pro Tour system right now, or for the season, was 150 points. Next season is going to be 200 points. So essentially the equivalent of 2 Elite Series wins. So the question I have, and I don't know what the answer to this is, but a thought experiment I want to do. Let's imagine that Isaac didn't win a major, but instead won 4 Elite Series events.
Okay.
Any 4, right? Just I don't want to try and pick which ones, but just hypothetically 4, right? And then all the other stats stay the same. Now, obviously, his average finish would pull down a little bit, and there'd be a little bit of changes, but he wins 4 Elite Series events. Does that, to you, start to like where does that, if you change that record, how does that change in your opinion, or does it?
It's tough. It becomes. It is what it is right now, which is that it's borderline. That it feels on the edge of, I'm not sure whether to value this consistent excellence or the ability to show up more often at the top. Right. And trust me, I think that the value of Isaac's 2 wins, in particular the Worlds win, is significantly higher than the value of Calvin's 2 wins. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And so that part is already not in question for me. In some ways, Josh, the framing that you just offered, which is that like next year majors are going to be worth double. Right. That's about right. When you think about the value of a major, like it's probably about double. Mm-hmm. So if we want to call it, imagine if it was 4 wins versus Calvin's 2. I mean, yeah, that's like, in my mind, that's about right. And and I do think it's important to be able to show up when the golf matters the most and win. It's the same reason we don't care as much when people win a silver. Right. You win silver, good for you. Now, obviously, there's a field strength question there, and the counterpoint to all of the major intense focus is that the field is more or less the same at all of these tournaments throughout the year. And sure, if you want to like be like, well, no, there were 20 more 1010 rated guys at this.
No.
Who cares?
Doesn't matter.
Talk to me about the 1030 plus guys, and most of the time, most of those guys are playing.
Right.
Whether it's an elite series or it's a major.
That is true. I don't know. When people tell me that though, it makes me think of like, if I look back at like, and I know people don't like team sport comparisons because they are drastically different, but like let's say Niners beat the Chiefs in the Super Bowl, but the Chiefs were to beat the Niners in the regular season. Oh, the field strength is basically the same. Like, it's same two teams. They both have a win. You got to weigh them equally. Like, that's not true. I don't care if they were the same field every time. Like, we have determined and collectively agreed that these events are the most important. And that's, whether you like it or not, I mean, that's kind of what the disc golf community and individual sports has decided is the case.
And I don't really like, Paul Ulibarri was on his podcast with Brody, the Tour Life podcast, this past week sometime. I saw a clip on social media complaining about how Worlds is overvalued, basically, that like, why does one tournament determine our entire season? And like, this is too much emphasis on one event. And, you know, why is it this, like, we should value. Look, that sounds a lot like Cope from somebody who's never won a Worlds. I'm sorry. Like,
yeah.
At the end of the day, I do not believe that the person who wins Worlds is the best player of the season. That's not that's not the metric in my mind. However,
if it was, this wouldn't be a discussion.
However, it is still the most important tournament of the season, and we all know that.
Yeah.
I know it. The fans know it. Everyone listening to this podcast knows it, and Yuli knows it. And you can complain about it if you want to, but like, everybody knows that the stakes are higher because this is the most prestigious tournament that we play. It gets a 5th round because of that, because we want to crown the best.
Yep.
And, you know, it used to be a little too crazy with 9 rounds and like double shotgun starts in a day, and like, it was like too much, but I think we still retain this level of respect for the tournament itself. Now, do I believe that whoever wins is the, you know, world champion, like somebody who wins the NBA finals is the world champion of basketball or the World Series of baseball? By the way, the Phillies.
Careful.
I mean, my God. Like, what? Philadelphia, what is going on? I saw some stat. Man. They're like the Phillies, the Eagles. No, it was the other. What sports was it? It was NHL,
Flyers.
Yep, and it was MLB, and what else has a 7-game series? I guess NBA. So Sixers.
Oh, Sixers. Okay.
Those 3 teams are 0-7 combined in Game 7s over the last 10 years or something like that. Sorry for my tangent.
Man, but can we just relish in the fact that Astros lose? Love that. Love that.
Everybody loves that.
Anyway, so but to go back,
let me finish my thought. Sorry.
I thought you didn't. We got.
I don't believe that like that's the World Series and that's it, right? Like, it's one tournament. It's sort of a silly name for a tournament that has never taken place outside of North America to call it the World Championships. But whatever. That doesn't matter that much. It is the most important tournament in disc golf. And we should give it the respect that it deserves. When somebody wins, they have earned it over 5 rounds on courses that challenge all aspects of your game in a mental pressure cooker with everybody on earth who plays competitive disc golf making the trek. Hundreds and hundreds of players, very, very skilled players. And if you can come through that gauntlet when you know it matters the most, that is why we watch. And you cannot hand wave it away and say, well, it shouldn't count for as much because why do we put it all in one tournament? Well, I don't put it all on one tournament, but I also understand that it is the most important tournament.
Yep. I mean, that's exactly right. And I think that's a great framing around why Isaac is in this discussion. Let me hit you with a couple of the stats that really I think are important for me when you look at Isaac.
Okay.
He's one of only 18 players in professional disc golf to have won MPO players to have multiple majors. He is the first player since Macbeth in 2019 to win multiple majors in a season. I don't know. I couldn't find the stat on how many players have won multiple majors in the season, but given that it used to just be Worlds and USDGC, I would imagine that the unique number, like the number of unique players who have done that is probably quite low.
Yeah, less than 18.
Yeah, no kidding. And if you include, and this is the one stat that I choose to kind of also include, when you include silvers, Isaac also played, I think, 1 or 2 non-tour events. Isaac does set the record for most money won by an MPO player in a season this year. Kristen obviously holds the overall record, but Isaac now has the MPO record. That all combines for a very, very compelling season. Let me give you the stat that knocks me, that I knock Calvin with a little bit. And this is the last, because, it's, yes, Isaac has a great season, but you have to also look at like the reason why I'm going to hit Calvin, and here it is. Beginning with Jonesboro, Calvin's worst round of the tournament came in the final round 10 times. So that's 50% of all tournaments. But if you start with Jonesboro, that number goes up, where his final round performance was the reason he didn't win tournaments. And I thought about going through and like pulling the average of other rounds, and then kind of comparing that to like where he would have finished. I think that's especially in 3-round tournaments is not, without knowing about like weather, and there are lots of factors that kind of go into that. But suffice it to say, if Calvin had just shot like his average of the tournament in the final round, he probably would have at least 5 wins right now.
I'm going to make a strong case for Calvin in a moment.
Okay.
But I want to hit some emails, because we got some emails that I started to see the sentiment turn against Calvin a little bit. And so here's one from Matt. Matt says he's firmly on Team Isaac. He says, I think Calvin would trade his season for Isaac's in a second, and Isaac would not trade his for Calvin's. I also think that 90% of touring pros, if offered either Calvin's or Isaac's season, would choose Isaac's, which brings up a larger point. Winning is more important than consistency. Imagine a hypothetical scenario where we have 2 players in the POTY conversation. One got second at every single event. The other alternated getting either first or dead last in every other event. Who of these 2 hypothetical players should be the player of the year? Everyone's picking the guy who won half the events, even if he played like garbage in the other half. Nobody is picking the guy who didn't win once, even if he did play very consistently. And so his point is simple. Winning and winning majors is more important than consistency. Similarly, says Matt, why pick Calvin over Isaac when Isaac has demonstrated an ability to win big tournaments, even if Isaac also got 30th to 50th at a couple tournaments? Calvin's ability to win only twice with 13 podiums is more of a knock against him in my mind rather than a testament to his consistency. With 13 podiums, you'd expect about 4 wins in a random sample. Paul or Ricky would probably get 6 to 8. Calvin only got 2. So that's Matt's thoughts. What do you say to that?
I would agree with Matt. I agree with that sentiment, and I think that highlights the idea that and part of the why that tide turned against Calvin, not winning since April, despite being the position, became a factor of disappointment, because I think he's correct when he says that Ricky and Paul probably would have won more. But anyway, I think you got a couple more emails. So.
Here's another hater email. Okay. Calvin hate. This one comes from Jack. So Calvin for elite events and majors in 2023 has been on 13 lead cards in the final round, has only won twice. Of his 2 wins, he didn't have to clutch up on either of them. At Vegas, Kevin Jones shanked his tee shot on 18 and double bogeyed. Calvin walked in a par to win by 2. At Jonesboro, Eagles shanked his tee shot on 18 and triple bogeyed. Calvin walked in a par to win by 3. Calvin's elite wins in 2022. Jonesboro, tied in regulation. Macbeth shanked his tee shot in the playoff. D-Glow, tied in regulation. Corey Ellis threw OB and Calvin walked into par to win. Calvin's elite wins in 2021. Ledgestone, tied with Ricky and last round canceled due to weather. Calvin's elite wins in 2020. Memorial, Eagle double bogeyed 18. Calvin won by 2. Jonesboro won by 1. And so the Jack's final wrap up here is Calvin is by far the most consistent player in MPO, but he's never had a dominant win on tour ever. You have to reward his consistency, but the guy barely manages to squeak out his wins, and most of the time they've been from other players' mistakes. With drops for 2023, Gannon's worst finish is 11th with 3 elite wins, and Isaac's worst is 25th with 2 dominant major wins. To me, that puts Calvin in 3rd for Player of the Year conversation, and it isn't close. So there's some thoughts from Jack.
I don't agree with Jack.
Jack coming in so hard.
It's interesting because I've never really considered the idea of like winning dominantly as being like the more valuable skill. I think I actually prefer the player who can win in clutch moments and like mistakes, like the fact he lists all these ones where he won it on 18. Like I think Calvin deserves credit for that, not being knocked.
I mean, Calvin didn't throw OB and take a double bogey.
That's right. He could have. I don't fully agree. Anyway.
Okay. So let's get back to some Calvin positivity here, because I don't know why. I think it's partly because Calvin is like the number 1 guy in disc golf right now. People like start to come for you when you're at the top, you know?
Sure.
First of all, let's just look at the straight up head to head. When Calvin and Isaac played the same event this year at Elite Series and Majors, Calvin beat Isaac 13 out of 19 times. Mm-hmm. Okay. Obviously, Isaac has the edge, the majors, where he finished ahead of Calvin 3 out of 4 times. Calvin only missed the top 5 3 times this entire season. And I think one of those was, I was just looking at this. I think one of those doesn't feel like it really should count as that. He was 7th at Portland. Mm-hmm. He was 6th at OTB, and he was 16th at Champions Cup. That's literally the list of times that he didn't finish inside the top 5. Okay. Mm-hmm. If you took just the points that he earned and were not counted towards his Disc Golf Pro Tour standings, that were not counted, and you created a separate Calvin clone, and you entered this Calvin clone into the Tour Championship standings, it would have made the Tour Championship with the points that he dropped.
It's the most compelling stat to me in Camp Calvin.
And when you look at his median finish was 3rd. Mm-hmm. Nobody else is even in the ballpark of this, Josh. Isaac's median finish was 7th. And median, by taking the median, we are not punishing Isaac for having a couple of like DNFs, right? It is removing those, not completely, but heavily limiting the effect of these outlier cases. Yes.
Which I think is a good. I like the median finish here,
because if you look at average finish, it's a walkover for Calvin. I mean, his average finish is 4th, and Isaac's was almost 16.
Yeah.
So I give Isaac credit, and yet still Calvin his median finish was podium.
Yeah.
That is an amazing accomplishment. And here's where it really comes down to. And this is where we start to get into the more philosophical side of this discussion, which is what is actually going to make people's decisions about the whole thing. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that the ability to show up at the majors is the thing that has to be the number 1 thing? Or do you feel like who played the best over the course of the season is the thing that should matter? Because I think if I just ask you who played the best over the course of the season, you have to say Calvin, right? There's no way to argue somebody else. Mm-hmm. But if you want to talk about the major stuff, we can. So let's get to the topic. Whose season would you rather have? I ask you.
Yeah, I would rather have Isaac's. I want the 1X next to my name. I want the discs that come in the selling with it. I want the contract negotiation that comes from it. Like,
let me ask you this: if you if you were signing Calvin or Isaac to a deal this year, who do you want to sign?
I'd sign
Isaac. Come on.
No, listen.
Come on.
Listen. Yes. No, you listen. Listen. What do manufacturers care about?
Marketability and selling a product.
Selling discs. That is it. That's the only thing, right? And this is where I think it actually is like it's tricky because I think Isaac, the margin of Isaac discs from where he was to now and like the trajectory moving forward and the discs sold at Worlds, I obviously don't have sales numbers and it's difficult with different companies, but I think that Worlds has more impact on selling discs than Calvin's season does. I would not be surprised if Isaac sold more discs than Calvin did this season.
I would be shocked. I would be floored. I would be left as a puddle on the ground if that's true. No chance. Calvin is the most popular player on earth right now. Now, we're getting a little sidetracked. Okay, we're getting a little sidetracked because Calvin's marketability factor shouldn't weigh in on the Player of the Year discussion.
Right, and that's why it starts getting weird and hard. But yeah,
but anyway, I think my point is like I would definitely take Calvin because I think his ability to be there on the coverage every single week, day in and day out. He's on the feature card most of the time. He's up there at the top all the time. Mm-hmm. That matters more than popping off a couple times. And that's really what it feels like. It feels like Isaac popped off a couple times and then was kind of not around that much. Like, let's be honest. Were you like, did you see Isaac winning Worlds?
No.
No.
I mean, yeah, like, no, I didn't.
So, whose season would you rather have? I feel like the problem with this question is that because of the value of Worlds, most people are going to say, I want Isaac's season, but the only reason they're saying it is because they want the Worlds. If he had won European and Champions Cup, I'm not sure that I'm not sure people would say the same thing.
I think I probably agree with you.
But like, obviously, it gets back to the same conversation. The value of Worlds is real. It is the most important tournament. And so most of the time, people are going to want to take the season that includes who won the Worlds, right? And if you ask players, they would be like, yeah, I want to have won Worlds.
Right.
And so they would choose that over an incredible season like Calvin's because they want the Worlds. And like the value of that tournament is so high. But to me, that fact alone does not decide who had the best overall season, who was the best player of the season, right? So it's a little bit of like a false choice. And I get why people who are in Camp Isaac want to ask this question because people are like, well, I want Isaac's season because he had 2 major wins, including Worlds. Ignoring the fact that Champions Cup is by far the least prestigious major. Yep. And in some ways holds less weight than some of the really heavy hitter Elite Series events.
I don't agree with that, but I see the point you're making and like agree that Champions Cup is definitely the least prestigious.
And so I guess my point is basically that if we're just going to come into this every year and we're going to look at who won the most majors and say that they had the best season, I think that's too simplistic and fails to account for the importance of being a good player throughout the entire year, right? The winner of the MVP in the NBA does not always win the NBA Finals. You don't always win the big one, but you can still be the best player. You know?
I think the last question though, and this is the one that I I kind of ask, if you take away Worlds and make it just European Open, I agree that I think the discussion is much easier. If you take away Champions Cup and just make it Worlds, I think the question is a cakewalk.
You think it's obviously Calvin if it was only Worlds?
It's obviously Calvin. I think it's obviously Calvin.
Okay.
Because, and here's why it's important to me. Isaac did something that very, very, very few players have ever done. And even fewer players have done in the same year, right? And I think it's hard because Calvin gets knocked both rightfully so, as well as I think just on like an intuitive level for never having won a major. And that hangs around his weight I think that hangs around his neck like a ball and chain this season, because not only was it his most dominant season ever, but he was in the lead at European Open. There was so much hype around it. And not only did he not win as much as he should have, he didn't win a major. And unfortunately for him, I think that does hang around his neck slightly. Here's the last thing that I'll say that I want to just have the question. And that is, what is the historical weight of Calvin's season? Because
like when we look back in the history books in 5 or 10 years,
yes,
no one's going to remember it.
They aren't.
I'll give you that.
And Gannon last season, his average finish, 7th. He had 14 top 10s. I mean, it wasn't Calvin's season, but it was a really, really consistent, really good season. When I think of most consistent seasons ever, the one I'm going to think of is going to be Paul McBeth in 2019, where his average finish was 2.1 and his median was 1 if you drop his 64th, where he went and had ankle surgery a week later after USDGC.
That was a crazy season.
Crazy season, right? So the problem is, and I know it's not the same, but it's difficult because what dominance looks like in this era is different than it used to look.
Yep.
Like. So it's hard to look at this season and say, yup, it's as dominant as Macbeth or Climo's seasons or in other seasons of years past. The second part that's hard, and the problem, what the hardest part is, the hardest part to swallow, is the fact that it could have been. 10 times Calvin shot his worst round at the final round of the tournament. If 2 or 3 of those are his best round or just average round, Calvin has the most dominant season in.
I hear you, but it's unfair to just crush Calvin for what could have been. Well, let's look at what he actually did, which was still win 2 tournaments, only miss the top 5 or the top 10 1 time all season, only miss the top 5 3 times all season, and just straight up ball out week in, week out every single time.
And that I was going to say, I think Calvin deserves Player of the Year. Even if this season is not going to be in the history books, like Calvin is a victim of expectations. As you talked about and said with Gannon, if he had not had his season last season, this would have been a spectacular breakout season that we would have been talking about, but it was disappointing because of how good his season was last year. Calvin is suffering from the expectations and the what could have been of his season. That should not deny him for Player of the Year. I hope that Calvin starts winning things, because otherwise, the Player of the Year is like, I think this Player of the Year is the most prestigious thing that he has thus far. And I mean, he's got to get majors if he wants to be a Hall of Fame.
So hang on a second. Are you saying that you're switching your mind here?
I will switch my mind to Calvin.
Wait, whoa. What convinces you here? You just got done telling me how it was Isaac. You're giving me all the stats.
No. So what convinces me for Calvin's, it's the missing top 5 only 3 times.
3 times.
Like that. 3 times. And I went and pulled like Gannon's stats, because I was like, oh yeah, Gannon's was super consistent last year as well. He missed top 10 5 times, right? Like, and that, or 4 times, and that was his super consistent season, right? So Calvin's is a level of consistency that I think is going to be very, very hard to replicate.
Let's put this up on the YouTube side of things. This is from Reddit. And let me get the let me get who posted this and give them credit here. This was from KD Spartan. Basically pulled finish, the field strength and size, and average rating at all of the tournaments this season, including the silvers. Okay, so we'll put it up so you can take a look at it if you're on the YouTube, and give us a little subscribe and hit that like button if you're watching over on YouTube. And I mean, to me, this puts it in perspective, right? I mentioned it earlier, right? 13 out of 19 times Calvin shot better than Isaac at the Elite Series and Majors. Okay. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the numbers in this context, I feel like it really shows you that Calvin was just the better overall player throughout the course of the season. Like you have to really heavily overweight the majors, I think, to convince yourself that Isaac should win this thing. Mm-hmm. And look at this. The Calvin's worst average tournament rating was 1035. That was his worst average rating at a tournament.
Yep.
That was Champions Cup when he finished 16th. 1035. He only averaged under 1040 3 times. Unsurprisingly, that was the 3 times he missed the top 5. But this guy was just an absolute lock for 1040, 1050, 1060 round ratings on average at tournaments. And just, look, it wouldn't be close if he'd won probably even one more tournament.
I agree. One more,
and if it's 2 more, it's just complete lock. And we talked about this coming into the Worlds to the end of the year stretch. It's like Calvin probably just needs one. Mm-hmm. And even after Isaac won Worlds, it was like, okay, well, Isaac could probably steal this thing outright if he gets one more, but he didn't get one more.
He didn't.
And now neither did Calvin. But The thing is, when you actually zoom out and you think about, okay, if I just go up to somebody on the street and I show them this and I say, hey, these ones are the most important. Okay, these ones, these ones are the majors. This one is the most important. It's like the Masters in golf. And you say, look at these 2 things and look at these numbers. Who is the best player this season? You can't not say Calvin. The answer is Calvin. Calvin was the best player this season. Now, are we going to look back in 10 years and be like, wow, remember that incredible season from Calvin? Probably not. But that's because the only thing that gets remembered is the aggregated stats. Who won Worlds? Who won USDGC? Mm-hmm. And that's a different conversation, right? That's about career legacy. Is this going to be a career defining year for Calvin? No. And if he has seasons like this for the next 10 years where he's just really good and never wins a major, it's going to be a what could have been story.
Yep.
Because from a legacy perspective, Isaac's done more this year, without a doubt, than Calvin. Because majors are the thing that we're going to actually talk about in the future. But that does not take away from the fact, from my perspective, that Calvin was the best player this year. He was the guy. Mm-hmm. And it's not like he was the guy half the time. He was the guy week in, week out. And yes, did he fail to clutch up sometimes? Yes, he did. It's disappointing. If you're a fan of Calvin, I mean, you got to be just kind of reeling at some of these event performances. When he blew it at European, it was brutal. Just brutal to watch him just kind of let a lead just kind of dither it away. But ultimately, his ability to go out there and perform at the highest level of disc golf pretty much every single week is something that, to me, defines what the Player of the Year award is all about. And he was the best player this season.
I agree. And it's hard. It's the long point, right? It's very difficult to try and cut out because Player of the Year needs to be a slice of just this year, right? It should not be around the expectations. It should not be around the long term. It needs to be what happened this year. And it's funny. And you know what else? When I was thinking about it, I think of Lamar Jackson's season, the year that they lost in the early round of the playoffs, when he won unanimous MVP, and then they get knocked out first game of the playoffs by the Titans, I think. no one's in a couple of years, no one's going to remember that season, right? No one's going to talk about it. But he still deserves the credit for it. And so too does Calvin deserve the credit for this year. I think there's a really interesting discussion about ceiling for Calvin, about what is his capacity, what is his mental state, and what this means for Calvin moving forward. But as it stands, when you take the snapshot, I think that Calvin's season is good enough. Isaac needed one more win. But
what changed your mind here? Like you're being genuine. You really thought you were gonna vote for Isaac at the end of this.
Legitimately thought I was gonna vote for Isaac. Yes. It was. I think it's the philosophical discussion about what player of the year should mean, right? Because when I came into it, I very heavily weighted the fact that in probably 2 years we're never going to talk about Calvin's season ever again, unless he's like the top again, right? Unless he keeps doing this or has a pop off season, we'll never talk about this season again. In context of Calvin, we will talk about Isaac's and Isaac, because eventually one day a player is going to win 2 majors and the stat's going to read first player since Isaac Robinson in 2023 to win 2 majors in a season.
Sure.
Right. Like those are the narratives and the graphics that I see in my head that makes me want to vote for Isaac. I think here's the other thing I'll say. I think that there will come a day when winning multiple majors is enough to end the discussion.
When people are not winning multiple majors very often.
Correct. And that's the other part that I had to think a lot about was are we in the state yet where winning multiple majors is going to be such like a difficult feat? It's been 4 years since the last player did it. I think once we get to the point where it's been 10 or 15 years, then winning multiple majors is enough to just close the door.
I think
right?
here's the thing I would also say. If you want to know how we would project players, right? And we would think about who's the best player, we would look at betting markets, because betting markets are going to give you true money on the line information about how people feel about the percentage odds of various people winning events.
Yep.
And if I was to put odds on next year's majors, right? So we have for MPO, we have, I don't know, like 25 months from now, we have European Open in July, and then we have Worlds, USDGC, and Champions Cup down the stretch, right?
Yeah.
And if we put odds on them now, are there any of those tournaments at which Calvin has worse odds than Isaac?
I gave James Conrad straight up favorites against Calvin.
But like, what do you think that if there were actual true betting markets, right? And people were putting money down on the line, who would be the favorite at these events? I could be convinced that Isaac Robinson should get the nod for Champions Cup, because
that's what I was going to say.
We don't know what the course is going to be, but like, assuming that the course is similar to what we saw at WR Jackson, we saw how fantastic he was, and he's been fantastic there. But like, are you genuinely going to put him above Calvin at the other events?
Probably not.
Probably not. Which to me tells you what you need to know, which is that Calvin is the better player on average, and he was the better player this season.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard because, man, like all this is like, I want to hold the POTY celebration outside of Calvin's shed, and then I want to get back in there and think about what he did this season. And
now you get back in there and you think about what you've done.
That's how I feel. That's how I feel, and that's why this is such like a hard decision. But it really was like the philosophical discussion about what player of the year needs to mean, and you can win player of the year, and heck, I think Calvin could win player of the year with a resume like this multiple years, and still not be a Hall of Fame player, and that's okay.
Oh yeah, that's an interesting conversation. I mean, he's not a Hall of Famer yet.
Nope.
Neither is Isaac, but
I don't think so either.
Like, yeah, I mean, I don't know if if he continues to win multiple Elite Series events a year and play at this kind of like super high level, if you took this season and you photocopied it and you said next 8 years he's going to play like this, I think that's Hall of Fame resume.
That's probably Hall of Fame.
It's enough,
resume.
Right? If you're getting some wins and you're playing like super, super top level and you're like the number one guy every year, that's enough.
But here, let me give you the counterpoint. Like, let's say he runs Gannon's resume last year, except Gannon wins an Elite Series instead of a major. I don't think this level of consistency is sustainable over 8 years.
Maybe not.
Don't think it's possible. Not the way the field's going. I don't think.
I will also say, like, I would also probably feel like if we had the same exact conversation next year, even if it was, a different player other than Isaac, but like somebody wins 2 majors and is good,
including
and then
Worlds.
Calvin is really good but only wins 2 Elite Series or whatever. Basically the same conversation. I'm going to be less inclined to pick Calvin because I'm going to get fatigued by the fact that he can't close out the ones that actually count the most.
Voter fatigue. Yeah. That's
a thing. It's a thing. But I don't feel that now, and I think it's going to just feel like it ages poorly to look at this. When we look back at this overall season, you think about who played the best in 2023. You really have to kind of do some mental gymnastics to argue that it's not Calvin.
I think that's true.
And like, if the only argument is that the majors matter the most, it's like, yeah, but like, do they matter that much the most?
I think that's the other tricky part. Every year the tours look different. The number of events have changed. Which events? Silver events, how much they're worth. Is it a series? I don't know. Like, it just changes year over year over year so much that it's also hard to contextualize. There used to be a national tour and now there's not. Like, so contextualizing what the value of an Elite Series should mean is something that's still in flux. And that's another tricky part about this discussion. But I admit it. I'm giving Calvin the Player of the Year. Get back in his shed. Let him think about what he's done.
A stunning victory for me on this pod. Okay, at least, I don't know if you saw this, but Mad Dog Chris Russo said, I don't know what, I think he's doing First Take now or something. I don't know. He's a pundit. He was miking the Mad Dog, classic New York sports talk radio, like the show that defined the genre. He's still got a Sirius XM show and stuff.
Okay.
He came out and he said, after Game 5 of the Phillies Diamondbacks series, he said that if the Diamondbacks came back and won Game 6 and 7, that he would retire on the spot. So now there's like questions about whether he's actually going to follow through. And he followed up last night on or before Game 7 and said, "I stand by what I said." So now we're waiting to find out. But at least we didn't stake our reputation on our career.
I was gonna say, are you wanting me to retire, Charlie? Is this a hit?
If Calvin wins POTY, I'm retiring from this podcast on the spot. Wow, very interesting. Well, I'm looking forward to getting the mail. If people have more thoughts on why it shouldn't be Calvin or why it should be Calvin, get them over to us, upshot@ultiworld.com. We got another show coming for you tomorrow, and we're going to be talking about some news that just dropped, actually, while we were doing this podcast. The Disc Golf Pro Tour is expanding into Europe. There's like basically a merger with the European Pro Tour. They're rolling everything under DGN. They're going to have 5, I think, Elite Series events in Europe. So we'll break all of that down tomorrow and talk with some folks from the tour about that as well. We've got some other news to catch up on. It's time to start talking about new signings. Carter Aarons to Lone Star.
Hot stove baby.
Season. It's here as the as spooky season begins here with Halloween coming up right around the corner. That's going to do it for this edition of The Upshot. For Josh Mansfield, I'm Charlie Eisenhood saying so long. We'll talk to you tomorrow right here on The Upshot.